The field hospital stood silent except for the distant rumble of artillery fire that shook the walls every few minutes. Rain hammered against the metal roof, mixing with the sound of approaching danger. In the flickering light of oil lamps, Nurse Margaret Chen moved between 15 wounded soldiers who lay on makeshift cots, their breathing labored, their faces pale. She was 23 years old, trained in Melbourne just 18 months earlier, and now faced with an impossible choice. The evacuation order had come an hour ago. Everyone else had left. But these men couldn't be moved, and she refused to leave them behind. If you're moved by stories of incredible courage and sacrifice, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of heroism from history. It was December 1942, deep in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. The Australian Field Hospital had been operating for 6 weeks in a clearing carved from dense tropical forest, supporting Allied forces pushing back against the Japanese advance along the Kokoda Track. Margaret had volunteered for this posting against her family's wishes. Her father, a doctor in Sydney, had tried to convince her to work in the safer city hospitals, but Margaret had seen the casualty lists growing longer each week, and she knew where she was needed most. Margaret had grown up in a family that valued service above comfort. Her grandfather had served as a medic in the First World War, returning with stories that shaped her childhood understanding of duty and sacrifice. Her mother had been a teacher who worked in underprivileged neighborhoods, believing that those with skills had an obligation to use them where they were needed most. These values weren't just spoken in the Chen household, they were lived daily. When Margaret announced at 17 that she wanted to become a nurse, her parents supported her immediately, even knowing the difficult path she was choosing. Her training at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney had been rigorous. The program demanded excellence, pushing students to their physical and mental limits. Margaret excelled not because nursing came easily to her, but because she refused to accept anything less than her best effort. She worked double shifts to gain more experience. She volunteered for the most challenging rotations. Her instructors noted that she possessed not just technical skill, but also an uncommon ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when chaos erupted around her. When war broke out, Margaret was 21 and had just completed her training. She watched as experienced nurses volunteered for military service, heading to field hospitals across the Pacific. She wanted to join them immediately, but her father convinced her to gain 2 more years of experience first. He knew the conditions she would face in a combat zone, and he wanted her to have every possible advantage. Those 2 years proved invaluable. She worked in the emergency ward, learning to make rapid assessments, to prioritize when resources were limited, to perform under the constant pressure of life and death decisions. The hospital consisted of 4 large tents connected by covered walkways, with a small operations area and a supply depot. It could handle 50 patients in normal circumstances, but normal had ceased to exist 3 days ago when intelligence reported a major Japanese offensive moving through the area. The order to evacuate came suddenly. Pack only essentials. Destroy what you can't carry. Move out within 2 hours. Margaret had been in the critical ward when Captain Morrison delivered the news. 15 men lay before her, most with severe injuries from the fighting 2 days prior. Corporal Davies had lost his left leg below the knee. Private Thompson had taken shrapnel across his chest and abdomen. Lieutenant Parker was recovering from emergency surgery to remove a bullet from near his spine. They were stable, but fragile. Moving them through the jungle in their condition would kill them as surely as leaving them for the enemy. Each of these men had a story that Margaret had come to know during their treatment. Corporal James Davies was 28, a carpenter from Adelaide who had enlisted with his 2 brothers. He'd been hit by mortar fire while helping to evacuate wounded from an exposed position. Even as the medics worked on his shattered leg, he'd kept asking about the other men, whether they'd made it out safely. His leg had been amputated 3 days ago, and he was still fighting infection, his body weakened by fever and blood loss. Private Andrew Thompson was barely 20, a farm boy from rural Queensland who'd lied about his age to enlist at 17. The shrapnel had torn through his torso in a dozen places, and it had taken 4 hours of surgery to remove the fragments and repair the damage. He had a photograph of his parents and younger sister that he kept under his pillow, looking at it whenever the pain became too much. He'd told Margaret about the wheat farm where he grew up, about his dreams of returning to work the land beside his father. Lieutenant William Parker had been one of the unit's most promising young officers, educated at Melbourne University before the war. The bullet had entered his lower back and lodged dangerously close to his spinal cord. The surgery to remove it had been performed under the most primitive conditions, with Margaret assisting as the doctor worked by lamplight with instruments that had been sterilized in boiling water. Parker had remained conscious through much of it, biting down on leather to keep from screaming. He'd survived, but his recovery required absolute stillness. Any jarring movement could cause permanent paralysis. Private Kevin Walsh had lost his right eye and suffered severe burns to his face and arms when a Japanese grenade exploded near his foxhole. The burns were healing slowly, requiring constant care to prevent infection. He was in tremendous pain, but he never complained, never asked for more than his fair share of the limited morphine supply. Before the war, he'd been a promising boxer in Sydney, training for a professional career. Now he faced a future where he'd never fight again, where his scarred face would mark him forever as a casualty of war. Sergeant Robert Mitchell had taken a bullet through his left lung. The round had miraculously missed his heart by centimeters, but his breathing remained labored and painful. He was 35, older than most of the enlisted men, a career soldier who'd served in North Africa before being transferred to the Pacific Theater. He had a wife and 3 children in Brisbane, and he carried their letters in his shirt pocket, reading them over and over during his long, painful nights. These weren't just patients to Margaret. They were men with families waiting for them, with dreams interrupted by war, with futures that deserved a chance to unfold. She knew their stories because she'd sat with them during their worst moments, holding their hands through surgeries, talking them through panic and pain, listening when they needed to speak about their fears and hopes. She'd written letters home for those too injured to write themselves, carefully choosing words that would comfort distant families without revealing the full extent of their loved ones' suffering. The other nurses had looked at each other with devastated expressions. They all knew what this meant. One by one, they prepared to leave, gathering their few personal belongings, helping load the ambulatory patients onto trucks. Nurse Williams squeezed Margaret's hand before departing, her eyes red with tears. The doctors left last, casting long looks back at the men they were abandoning. Margaret stood in the center of the tent as the last truck engine faded into the jungle. The rain continued its steady assault on the canvas above. She took a deep breath and got to work. If she was going to defend this position, she needed to prepare. She gathered all the medical supplies she could carry and organized them near the central area where the most critical patients lay. She collected water, knowing the supply might be cut off. She found 3 rifles left behind with ammunition and positioned them at strategic points around the tent. She wasn't a soldier. Her training had been in anatomy, in wound care, in the delicate work of saving lives, but her father had taught her to shoot growing up on their property outside Sydney, and she understood basic tactical thinking from the officers she'd worked alongside these past months. The field hospital was positioned on slight elevation, with the jungle thick on 3 sides and a narrow supply road on the 4th. If the enemy came, they'd likely approach from the jungle. Private Cooper, despite his bandaged shoulder and cracked ribs, insisted on staying awake to help watch. He was only 19, with sandy hair and the kind of optimism that war hadn't yet crushed. Margaret tried to convince him to rest, but he refused. They worked together to create basic defensive positions, using supply crates and equipment to provide some cover. As night fell, the jungle came alive with sounds. The artillery had stopped, which somehow made things worse. In the silence, every snapping branch became a threat. Margaret checked on each patient, adjusting IVs, administering pain medication, changing dressings. She spoke softly to each man, her calm voice providing reassurance even as her own heart raced with fear. Corporal Davies asked her why she'd stayed. She told him the truth. Because they would do the same for her. Because some lines couldn't be crossed. Because running away wasn't who she was. The attack came at dawn. Margaret was checking Lieutenant Parker's vitals when she heard movement in the jungle to the east. Multiple sets of footsteps, branches breaking, the distinctive sound of equipment being moved through dense vegetation. She grabbed the nearest rifle and positioned herself behind a supply crate, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Private Cooper moved to a position covering the north approach, his face set with determination. The waiting had been the hardest part. Through the night, Margaret had run through scenarios in her mind, trying to prepare for what she knew was coming. She'd thought about her family back in Sydney, wondering if she'd ever see them again. Her mother's face came to mind, the way she'd looked when Margaret announced she was volunteering for overseas duty. There had been pride mixed with terror in her eyes. Her younger brother James had saluted her at the train station, trying to be brave even though he was only 16. She wondered if they'd ever know what happened here if things went badly. But those thoughts had to be pushed aside now. Survival required absolute focus. She'd positioned water within reach of each defensive point, knowing dehydration could become as dangerous as enemy fire in the tropical heat. She'd torn strips from spare sheets to use as bandages if she or Private Cooper were wounded. She'd even written brief notes to each family, tucking them into her uniform pocket just in case. The notes were simple, telling them their loved ones had been brave, that they'd been cared for until the very end, that they hadn't been alone. They emerged from the tree line like shadows materializing from the mist, Japanese soldiers, approximately 40 based on what Margaret could count in those first terrifying seconds. They wore mud-stained uniforms, carried rifles with fixed bayonets, and moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced infantry. Their officer barked orders in Japanese, and the soldiers began to fan out, clearly preparing to surround the hospital. Margaret's mind raced through her limited options. She had 3 rifles with approximately 120 rounds of ammunition total. Private Cooper could help, but he was injured and his mobility was limited. The hospital's position offered some advantages. The slight elevation and the clearing that surrounded it meant approaching forces would be exposed. But 40 trained soldiers against 2 defenders, one of them wounded, made the mathematics of survival brutally clear. She thought about her father in that moment, remembering the shooting lessons on their property outside Sydney. He'd taught her to shoot when she was 12, insisting that a girl growing up in the Australian bush needed to know how to handle a rifle. She'd resisted at first, finding the noise and recoil unpleasant. But her father had been patient, teaching her proper breathing, steady aim, the importance of remaining calm under pressure. Those lessons, taken on sunny weekends years ago, now stood between 15 wounded men and almost certain death. Margaret fired the first shot. It was a warning, deliberately aimed high, and it froze the advancing soldiers for a crucial moment. She shouted in English, her voice carrying across the clearing. The hospital was under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Wounded men lay inside. She demanded they withdraw. The Japanese officer responded by ordering his men forward. Margaret fired again, this time not as a warning. A soldier fell. Then another. Private Cooper opened fire from his position, and suddenly the quiet morning exploded with the crack of rifles and the shouts of men. The Japanese soldiers took cover, surprised by the resistance. They'd expected an abandoned facility, easy pickings. Instead, they faced determined fire from defenders who knew exactly what they were protecting. Margaret moved between positions, using the terrain and the structures to her advantage. She'd fire several shots from one location, then quickly relocate before return fire could find her. It was exhausting, terrifying work that required absolute focus. The Japanese commander was methodical in his approach. He sent scouts to probe different angles, testing the defensive fire, trying to identify weak points. Margaret watched their movements, adjusting her position to cover the most vulnerable approaches. She was acutely aware of every round she fired, knowing that ammunition was finite, and once it ran out, the defense would collapse. She forced herself to take careful aim with each shot, making every bullet count. Private Cooper's position covered the northern approach, where the jungle was thickest. Despite his injuries, he maintained steady fire, preventing the enemy from gaining ground on that flank. Margaret could hear him grunting with pain each time the rifle's recoil jarred his wounded shoulder, but he never faltered. Between exchanges of fire, they shouted updates to each other, coordinating their defense as best they could. Inside the tent, the wounded men lay in terrible suspense. They could hear the battle raging around them, the crack of rifles, the sound of bullets striking trees and equipment. Some prayed silently, others gripped whatever they could reach, their knuckles white with tension. Corporal Davies, despite his fever and pain, had dragged himself to where he could see the entrance, determined that if the enemy broke through, he wouldn't die lying down. Lieutenant Parker, unable to move without risking paralysis, stared at the tent ceiling and counted the shots, trying to gauge how the battle was progressing. An hour passed in a blur of action and fear. Margaret's arms ached from the recoil of the rifle. Sweat poured down her face despite the morning cool. Behind her, the wounded men lay as still as possible, some praying, others simply staring at the tent ceiling, fully aware that their lives depended on a young nurse they'd known for only a few weeks. She reloaded with shaking hands, counting her remaining ammunition. It wouldn't last much longer at this rate. The physical demands were overwhelming. Each time she fired, the rifle's kick slammed into her shoulder, adding to the growing bruise there. Her ears rang constantly from the gunfire in the enclosed space. Smoke from discharged weapons hung in the humid air, mixing with the smell of fear and blood. Between exchanges of fire, she would dash back to check on her patients, ensuring IVs hadn't been pulled loose, that bandages remained secure, that no one was going into shock from the stress. Sergeant Williams, who'd been unconscious from morphine when the attack started, had woken to the sounds of battle. Despite his severe abdominal wounds, he insisted on trying to help, managing to reload magazines for her with trembling hands. It saved precious seconds during the firefight. Private Morrison, whose hands had been badly burned, couldn't hold a weapon but positioned himself where he could watch the southern approach, calling out warnings when he spotted movement. Even in their weakened state, these men were fighting back in whatever way they could. The Japanese soldiers were professional and persistent. They'd probe one section of the perimeter, draw fire, then immediately test another area. They were trying to identify weak points, to understand the defensive setup. Margaret recognized the tactic from conversations with officers during quieter times. She varied her response, sometimes firing immediately, sometimes holding fire to create uncertainty about her positions. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat. The Japanese commander adjusted his tactics. He ordered his men to maintain suppressing fire from covered positions, while a smaller group attempted to advance using the jungle as cover. Margaret spotted the movement and shifted her position to intercept. She fired in quick succession, forcing the advancing soldiers to ground. But the sustained engagement was depleting her ammunition at an alarming rate. She had perhaps 40 rounds left. Private Cooper was in even worse shape, down to maybe 20 rounds. The enemy fire intensified. Bullets struck the supply crates Margaret was using for cover, sending splinters flying. One round passed so close to her head that she felt the displacement of air. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. She had moved beyond fear into a strange state of focused clarity where nothing existed except the next shot, the next target, the next second of survival. During a brief lull in the fighting, Margaret risked a glance back at her patients. They were watching her with expressions that would stay with her for the rest of her life. There was fear there, certainly, but also trust and gratitude and something that looked like awe. Private Thompson, the young farm boy, gave her a weak thumbs up. Sergeant Mitchell, despite his pain, managed a slight nod of encouragement. These small gestures of solidarity gave her strength to continue. The Japanese commander tried a different approach. He sent a small group to flank from the west, hoping to catch the defenders from an unexpected angle, but Margaret had positioned herself where she could see all approaches, and she spotted the movement. She shifted her fire, forcing them back into cover. Private Cooper, despite his injuries, continued to hold the northern sector, his face pale with pain but his aim steady. Around the 2-hour mark, Margaret knew they were in serious trouble. Ammunition was running desperately low. She was down to perhaps 20 rounds. Private Cooper had fewer. The Japanese had pulled back slightly, regrouping, clearly planning a final assault that would overwhelm the remaining defenders. Margaret checked on her patients again, offering water to those who could drink, adjusting blankets, speaking words of comfort. She wasn't sure she believed herself. Lieutenant Parker, barely able to move, asked her to leave, save herself while there was still time, slip into the jungle and escape. She refused without hesitation. She'd made her choice hours ago, and she wouldn't abandon it now. The men looked at her with expressions that mixed gratitude, admiration, and profound sadness. They all knew how this would likely end. Then, cutting through the tension like a blade through fabric, came a sound that changed everything. The distant drone of aircraft engines. Margaret's heart leaped with desperate hope. She looked up through a gap in the tent, scanning the cloudy sky. There, emerging from the clouds to the south, came 3 Royal Australian Air Force planes. Someone had sent help. Somehow, word had reached command about the field hospital situation. The aircraft made a low pass over the area, their presence immediately obvious to the Japanese soldiers below. Margaret saw the enemy troops looking up, confusion and concern spreading through their ranks. The planes circled back, and this time they opened fire with machine guns, breaking the tree line where the Japanese had taken cover. The enemy formation broke, soldiers scrambling for better protection as bullets tore through the jungle canopy. The aircraft made several more passes, their sustained fire forcing the Japanese to withdraw. Margaret watched through blurred vision as the enemy soldiers pulled back into the jungle, their assault broken by the unexpected aerial intervention. The planes continued their patrol, circling the area to ensure the enemy had truly retreated. One pilot dipped his wings as he passed over the hospital, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. 20 minutes later, Margaret heard new sounds from the supply road. Engines, multiple vehicles, moving fast. She grabbed her rifle again, unable to trust that the danger had passed. But the vehicles that emerged carried Australian and American forces, a relief column that had pushed through the Japanese lines after receiving the desperate radio transmission sent before the evacuation. Medical personnel jumped from trucks even before they fully stopped, rushing into the tent to assess the wounded. A captain from the Australian Army approached Margaret where she stood, still holding the rifle, her body trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, perhaps, or disbelief. He asked if she had really held off 40 soldiers for 3 hours with just one injured private to help her. Margaret shrugged, suddenly exhausted beyond words. She'd done what needed to be done. The men had needed someone to stay, so she stayed. The evacuation proceeded quickly and efficiently now, with proper equipment and enough personnel to move the wounded safely. Stretchers were brought in, medical supplies replenished, IV fluids checked and replaced. Margaret moved through it all in a daze, still functioning on instinct, checking each patient as they were prepared for transport. Private Cooper was loaded onto a truck, giving her a weak smile as the medics worked on his injuries. Corporal Davies clasped her hand as they carried him past, unable to speak through his emotion. News of what had happened spread through the Allied forces with remarkable speed. A 23-year-old nurse had single-handedly defended 15 wounded men against overwhelming odds, holding a defensive position through skill, determination, and raw courage. By the time Margaret reached the main base camp 2 days later, her actions had become the subject of intense discussion among commanders and soldiers alike. The formal recognition came weeks later. Margaret was awarded the George Medal for Gallantry, one of the highest honors for civilian bravery in the British Commonwealth. The citation detailed her actions with military precision, but the words couldn't fully capture the reality of those 3 hours, the impossible choices, the terror and determination that had carried her through. At the ceremony, she wore her nurse's uniform, standing awkwardly in the spotlight as officers read the commendation. The ceremony took place at Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, with senior officers from Australian, American, and British forces in attendance. Margaret stood at attention while a general pinned the medal to her uniform, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the moments she didn't fire, the Japanese soldiers who were also someone's sons and brothers, the impossible moral weight of having taken lives to save lives. War forced choices that no training could prepare you for, decisions that would echo through the rest of your existence. After the ceremony, a journalist from Melbourne wanted to interview her for a newspaper story. Margaret declined politely but firmly. She didn't want to be portrayed as some kind of action hero. What she'd done wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about 15 human beings who deserved to live, who had families waiting for them, who had already sacrificed so much. Making her the center of the story felt like a betrayal of that truth. The journalist persisted, asking what she'd been thinking during those 3 hours. Margaret's answer was simple and honest. She'd been thinking about keeping her patients alive. Everything else was just noise. The other nurses treated her differently after the incident, some with awe, others with a kind of careful distance, as if what she'd done had set her apart in ways that made them uncomfortable. Margaret understood. She'd crossed a line they hadn't, taken actions that challenged the traditional boundaries of their profession. In the quiet moments, she wondered if she'd made the right choice. Logically, she knew that one nurse's life might have been worth preserving even at the cost of 15 wounded soldiers who might not have survived anyway. But logic had nothing to do with it. She couldn't have lived with herself if she'd abandoned them. What struck Margaret most in the aftermath was the responses from the men she'd saved. They wrote letters, some from hospital beds as they recovered, others from new postings as they returned to duty. They told her she'd given them something more precious than life itself. She'd shown them that they mattered, that they weren't expendable numbers in a vast war machine, that someone cared enough to risk everything for them. Private Cooper wrote that he'd named his daughter after her when he returned home to Tasmania. Corporal Davies said he thought of her courage every time he felt like giving up during his difficult recovery. Margaret continued her service in Papua New Guinea for another 8 months before returning to Australia. She worked in a hospital in Brisbane, treating the endless stream of wounded that flowed back from the Pacific Theatre. She never spoke much about that December morning in the jungle. When pressed, she would say simply that she'd been trained to care for patients, and leaving them wasn't an option she could live with. The deeper truth, the fear and desperation and fierce determination that had sustained her through those hours, remained mostly private. After the war ended in 1945, Margaret returned to Sydney. She completed additional training and became a head nurse at a major hospital specializing in trauma care. She married a schoolteacher named Robert in 1948, and they had 3 children. She taught nursing at the University of Sydney in the 1960s, passing on not just technical skills, but also the profound ethical foundation that had defined her service during the war. She emphasized to her students that their duty was to their patients first, always, regardless of circumstances or personal risk. The transition to civilian life had been harder than Margaret expected. The structure and purpose of wartime service had given her days clear meaning. Back home, peacetime nursing felt both easier and somehow less significant. She struggled with nightmares for years, waking in the dark with her heart racing, convinced she heard soldiers moving through the jungle. Robert, patient and understanding, would hold her until the panic passed. He never pressed her to talk about the war, understanding that some experiences lived beyond the reach of words. Her children grew up knowing their mother had been decorated for bravery, but not really understanding what that meant until they were older. Her daughter Emily once asked her directly if she'd been scared during the battle. Margaret had thought carefully before answering. Yes, she'd been terrified. Fear didn't make you weak. Fear was rational. What mattered was what you did despite the fear. She wanted her children to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly in the face of it. In her teaching, Margaret became known for her exacting standards and her deep compassion. She pushed her nursing students hard, demanding technical excellence, but she also taught them to see the whole person behind each patient. She'd share stories from the war, not about the violence, but about the small acts of kindness that had sustained morale, the importance of a gentle touch, the power of simply being present with someone in their suffering. Some of her former students would later say that she taught them not just how to be nurses, but how to be truly human in the face of human suffering. Returning to civilian life proved more difficult than Margaret had anticipated. The transition from a world where every decision carried life or death consequences to the routine rhythms of peacetime nursing left her feeling disconnected and restless. She experienced nightmares about that December morning in the jungle, waking in cold sweats with the sound of gunfire echoing in her ears. Her father, understanding what she was experiencing in ways few others could, helped her find a therapist who specialized in working with veterans. The healing process was slow but steady. Margaret threw herself into her work, finding purpose in training the next generation of nurses. She became known for her exacting standards, but also for her genuine care for her students. She could spot when a student was struggling not just with the material, but with the emotional weight of the profession. She'd pull them aside for quiet conversations, sharing carefully chosen pieces of her own experience, helping them understand that doubt and fear were natural responses that didn't have to define their capabilities. Her marriage to Robert provided stability and joy she hadn't thought possible during the dark years of war. He was gentle and patient, understanding when she needed space to process difficult memories, providing comfort when the past became too heavy to carry alone. They built a life together in a modest house in the Sydney suburbs, raising their 3 children with the same values of service and compassion that had guided Margaret's choices during the war. She rarely discussed her wartime experience in her teaching, but students who researched her background would discover the truth and look at the quiet, precise woman with new understanding. On the few occasions when she did speak about the war, she focused not on her own actions, but on the resilience and courage of the wounded men she'd served alongside. She talked about Corporal Davies learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg, about Lieutenant Parker recovering fully and becoming a lawyer, about Private Cooper returning to his family farm and building a good life for his children. Margaret maintained correspondence with several of the men she'd saved. The letters arrived regularly over the decades, updating her on their lives, their families, their triumphs and struggles. Corporal Davies sent her a photograph when his daughter was born in 1947, writing that seeing his child for the first time made him understand even more deeply what Margaret's courage had given him. Lieutenant Parker invited her to his wedding in 1950, where he introduced her to his bride by saying simply that Margaret was the reason he was alive to fall in love. Private Thompson wrote faithfully every Christmas, his letters filled with news about the farm and his growing family, always ending with the same line expressing gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. These connections sustained Margaret through difficult times and reminded her that her choice to stay had created ripples that extended far beyond that single morning. Each birth announcement, each wedding invitation, each letter detailing the ordinary joys and challenges of peacetime life represented a future that wouldn't have existed if she'd chosen differently. The weight of that knowledge was sometimes overwhelming, but it also provided profound meaning to her continued work in nursing and education. In 1982, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, several of the men she'd saved organized a reunion. They gathered in Melbourne, now in their 60s, bringing their families to meet the woman who had given them the chance to have these lives. Margaret sat surrounded by children and grandchildren of men she'd defended with a rifle in a jungle tent 4 decades earlier. They shared stories, some funny, some heartbreaking, all testifying to the ripples that spread from a single act of courage. The reunion lasted 3 days, filled with laughter and tears and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Corporal Davies, walking confidently on his prosthetic leg, spoke about how Margaret's example had taught him that limitations existed only in the mind. He'd built a successful carpentry business after the war, employing other veterans and creating beautiful furniture that now filled homes across Australia. Lieutenant Parker, now a respected judge, credited Margaret with teaching him the true meaning of duty and sacrifice, lessons that had guided his legal career and his efforts to ensure justice for all who appeared in his courtroom. Private Thompson brought his entire family, 7 children and 14 grandchildren, all of them alive, because Margaret had refused to abandon their father and grandfather in that jungle hospital. They presented her with a quilt they'd made together, each square containing an image or message representing the life Thompson had lived because of her courage. Margaret wept openly as she examined it, overwhelmed by the tangible representation of what her choice had created. The reunion also included the families of men who had since passed away. Sergeant Mitchell's widow attended with their grown children, bringing letters he'd written over the years about Margaret's courage. Private Walsh's son, now a doctor himself, spoke about how his father's stories had inspired him to enter medicine, wanting to help others the way Margaret had helped his father. These testimonies painted a picture of influence that extended across generations, shaping lives and choices in ways Margaret had never imagined. Private Cooper, now a grandfather himself, spoke for the group. He said that what Margaret had done went beyond simple bravery. She'd made a decision that defined what it meant to truly care for another human being. In that moment when everyone else had to leave, when staying meant almost certain death, she'd looked at 15 wounded men and decided their lives were worth that risk. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't foolish. It was the purest expression of human compassion he'd ever witnessed. His words captured something essential about Margaret's choice that had remained unspoken for 4 decades. She hadn't stayed because of orders or duty or even training. She'd stayed because the alternative, abandoning vulnerable men to certain death, violated something fundamental in her character. The decision hadn't been difficult in the moment because there had really been no decision at all. Some lines couldn't be crossed. Some choices defined who you were at the deepest level. Margaret had simply acted in accordance with her values, even when those values demanded everything she had to give. Margaret lived to be 87 years old, passing away peacefully in 2006, surrounded by her family. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, including several elderly veterans who traveled across Australia to pay their respects. The eulogy was delivered by the son of Corporal Davies, who spoke about the legacy of courage that extended far beyond a single battle. He talked about how his father had raised him to value service and sacrifice because of what he'd witnessed that December morning in New Guinea. The memorial service included testimonies from her former students, many now senior nurses and hospital administrators themselves. They spoke about Margaret's teaching philosophy, her insistence that nursing was not just a profession, but a calling that demanded moral courage alongside technical skill. They shared stories about her mentorship, her ability to inspire excellence while providing compassionate support through the challenges of training. Several mentioned that Margaret had never told them about her wartime service directly, but once they discovered it, everything about her approach to nursing made perfect sense. Her children spoke about growing up with a mother who lived her values quietly but consistently. She taught them through example rather than lectures, showing them that courage wasn't about dramatic gestures, but about showing up every day and doing what was right, even when it was difficult. They shared memories of her volunteering at community health clinics, mentoring struggling students, advocating for better working conditions for nurses. Margaret's heroism hadn't ended in that Papua New Guinea jungle. It had simply taken different forms as she found new ways to serve throughout her life. Her story became part of the historical record, studied by military historians and medical ethicists as an example of extraordinary dedication under impossible circumstances. The field hospital site was eventually marked with a memorial, a simple stone listing the names of the 15 men who survived because one young nurse refused to leave them behind. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra includes her medals and a detailed account of her actions, ensuring that future generations understand what she did and why it mattered. What Margaret demonstrated that day transcended military strategy or tactical brilliance. She showed that even in the midst of war's chaos and cruelty, individual acts of courage and compassion could make an absolute difference. She had training, skill, and determination, but what sustained her through those 3 hours was something deeper, a fundamental belief that human life had value worth defending at any cost. She'd been given an impossible choice, and she'd chosen to stay. The 15 men who survived carried that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. They built families, pursued careers, contributed to their communities, all because one person decided they were worth saving. Their children and grandchildren exist because Margaret Chen stood in a jungle clearing with a rifle in her hands and refused to run. That's the true measure of her legacy, not in medals or commendations, but in the countless lives touched by her singular act of courage and the profound reminder that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stay when everything tells us to go.